I'm actually just going to start off by asking our past presidents quite an open question, and just would like to know your personal reflections on the Royal Commission. Can I start with you, Trevor?
Yes, you certainly can. Well, it was a brutal and searing experience for those of us closely involved. You know, I think Royal Commissions have got a very proud history in this country, and a lot of good comes out of many of them, if not all of them, and I think a lot of good will come out of this one. I think that the whole system needed a wake-up call, and that's certainly what's happened. But I would like to stress that there's sort of hundreds of thousands of people working in the industry don't all get up in the morning saying, you know, how are we going to rip off a client today? It doesn't actually work like that at all. So the question of balance, I think, is important. I think the results will be positive for the industry, very, very much so, but there's been quite a personal cost involved in some examples. The case study approach, I thought, was fabulously effective. I think it's very good, and of course the case studies presented were just some of the case studies that the Commission studied. So I think there's a lot of good work that will come out as a result of it. But it was a difficult process, and I think the fact that the press were played up to was you know, perhaps a bit too far. That's my personal comment.
Yeah. Estelle?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I reflect, I think the damage to the reputation of financial services industry has been very significant, and it will require a significant amount of work and investment to rebuild. And I found some stats, because I like stats, on the impact on trust. So this is a research poll by Core Data, and they do a poll of 1,000 people every quarter, and the key question probed views about the extent to which an organisation would act in the respondent's best interests. And superannuation was 75% said yes, that they would act. They thought that they would act in their best interest. That was in Q1 2018. That had dropped to 54% by the end of the year. Banking started at 61% and dropped to 36%. Insurance, sadly, started at 42%. And ended at 30%. So I guess the good news for insurance is it dropped less. I think, again, echoing what Trevor said, obviously insurance is often there for people, or for a lot of thousands of people, insurance is there when they have very difficult and traumatic events, and yet a trust score of 42% to start with is not great. So a huge amount of work, I think, from the insurance industry, not just to rebuild from the 30%, but to build on the starting point of 42% in terms of trust.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thanks, Nicoletta. I found the Royal Commission surprising, because I did not expect the level of poor conduct that emerged. I just didn't think that it was like that, and I know it was extremes, and I think the Royal Commission played it up, and it was a very legalistic approach. So I think it was very, very tough, and that's why you get these trust problems being so substantial when, as Trevor says, most people don't get up in the morning wanting to do that. The thing that surprised me in the end more was the CBA report, because the Royal Commission showed outcomes of poor conduct. But what the CBA report did was show why and how that happened. I was astonished at the way the board, the chairman of the Board Audit Committee, the chairman of the Board Risk Committee, and the corresponding chief officers, the way they did not communicate, the way the CEO did not hold his senior people accountable, and the report didn't really say that. But if you read that report again and say, where was the CEO in all of this? I don't think he was visible enough. So you've got leadership and culture problems from the board downwards, and that's what astonished me. And even before the report astonished me, I was surprised that APRA felt the need to do it. Yeah. But what it showed. What the report showed was that APRA was absolutely justified, yeah, because APRA was unable to get behind the behaviour of the board. It knew it was there, but it didn't know how to, on its own, to deal with it. So I think we've got a very big, and the self-assessment that John Lonsdale referred to that's recently been done of other institutions I would be surprised, especially now, if they were as bad as the CBA was. And yet the CBA was enormously profitable. So you then think, well, now where does all that go in the Royal Commission thing? The Royal Commission had a big emphasis on consumers, and so we now come to the situation where the balance between shareholder and consumer interests is now top of mind for everybody, and that's, to me, if you like, the biggest generalised message I can think of.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just going to ask our panel about the impact on the various practice areas, and then we're going to go to the questions, the SMS questions. So, Estelle, can I start with you? Just reflections on what it means for general insurance.
Okay, so for general insurance, I mean, general insurance wasn't as highly visible as some other areas, but of the 76 recommendations, I think 30 of them will impact general insurers. So, you know, a high proportion of the total. 15 of those recommendations are about the regulators, including code of practice. 8 are around remuneration, culture and governance. 3 are probably around claims, 2 are around selling, and 2 around add-on insurance, which was probably the key area that general insurers were criticised for, was low-value products in terms of the add-on insurance sold through motor vehicle dealers. On top of that, also, obviously both general and life insurers also dealing with the design and distribution obligations, which will come into effect from 2021. So what's it going to mean? It's going to mean, I think, firstly, there's a lot of uncertainty, because for some of the recommendations, how they're actually implemented might mean it will have a minor issue, or they may have very large issues. So the anti-hawking, I think, is a good example of that from an implementation perspective. So I think how's it also affecting them? Directors are thinking a lot about non-financial risk, as Pauline said. I think they're struggling in terms of how they think about that, and I think the APRA information paper, I think, highlights that as well. And what was interesting to me from the APRA information paper on the self-assessment, John, was actually that whilst organisations identified some quite long-standing issues and weaknesses in non-financial risk, almost, I think all of them, from my understanding of the paper, the boards and the management teams rated their own performances very good. So I think that highlights the issue of self-assessments in terms of looking at culture and looking at how the organisation is dealing with conduct risk. Management, that people are recruiting a lot of risk and compliance people. There aren't that many, salaries are going up, they're getting bigger budgets in that area. Is that distracting from budgets in other areas of the company that's needed? And I think generally for general insurers, there's a sense that it's raising the bar. So it's raising the bar in terms of what is expected of companies. Processes, documentation, compliance, managing complaints, oversight of product sellers overall. I think overall, if I put that all together, I think there's going to be a lot more work. I think there's more cost involved. I think for some businesses, or a lot of businesses, the actual fundamental business model won't really change in terms of how they do business. I think that there are some business models, particularly those around motor vehicle dealers, maybe some other product sellers, where I think there's got to be question marks about whether there's an ongoing viability for those businesses.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, John, can you cover the life?
Okay, thank you. Just about everything that Estelle just said about general insurance applies also to life insurance, but life insurance has got a much more difficult road to hoe here, because there was so much emphasis in the Royal Commission on advisors, and while much of that was around wealth or investment type advice, there was also clearly significant attention to life insurance risk, and so there's a big job to be done, the code of conduct, but really the advisor fraternity looks like it will diminish substantially in size. We've got the life insurance framework that's come through, which is limited commissions, which, to go to Pauline's point about first mover disadvantage. Some of these first mover disadvantages can only be fixed by government intervention, and that's at least what's happened. So and it started last year in life insurance. So that gets us going on the road. But the commission or the advisor field is going to have to change enormously, and we're hanging over both industries, both insurance industries, is the threat of nil commissions in the future. And I think it's incumbent on both industries to work very hard to demonstrate why you don't have to call them, they don't have to be commissions, but payments by the insurer rather than the customer are the only way that these industries are going to perform their economic function properly in the future. The other thing I'd like to mention is the profitability, which is another part of the difficulty of the life industry. Very difficult pricing and profitability environment. And APRA put out recently a statement on disability income insurance, which has cost the life insurance industry hugely. And Trevor would know better than me, but it wouldn't surprise me if that problem isn't the primary reason why AMP has actually decided to get out of the life insurance industry, to the astonishment of most of the community. Now, the disability income, what the APRA paper does is put on the record a whole lot of problems in the industry, most of which are first mover disadvantage type problems. And what APRA appears to have done, and I'm very interested to see how this plays out because this is all very recent, is how the ACCC, which basically prevents collusion, of course, but really more than just collusion, APRA has come along and said, well, look, you can't run this industry properly unless you do things a bit differently. And we, the regulator, are willing to assist the industry to do things in a way that that works better. But underlying a lot of this is conflicts of interest, and somehow the industry has to figure out how to remove conflicts of interest without damaging its business model, and that's the challenge.
Yeah, thank you. And Trevor, do you want to cover super?
Yeah, just briefly perhaps, there are 9 recommendations that impact superannuation, most of which I think most people would agree are very, very sensible. Like, for example, having only one default account, that's been an issue that's plagued the superannuation system since the beginning. No entertaining of employees. Trustees should have no other role. No advice fees from my super accounts. You can debate that one, I think, a little bit. Limit the advice fees from choice accounts. No hawking of superannuation products. Adjusting the ASIC and APRA roles a little bit. Extending BEAR to RSEs and more civil penalties. I think, though, that the thrust of it all is that the role of the superannuation trustee has been raised right up and examined very, very carefully, and you will see, therefore, quite significant change in the behaviour of trustees going forward.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to go now to some of the SMS questions. So I'm going to look at that bottom one. I can hardly see them. There's quite a small font here. So insurers have had risk management frameworks in place for many years. How and why did these fail? And I might ask John, you to respond to that. That's a big question.
Well, it is a big question. How have those risk management frameworks failed?
Can I
Trevor,
just jump in?
First?
I mean,
Yeah.
sitting around a board table, you get all this information, you get hundreds of pages of reports and all that sort of thing. But the big issue is with these frameworks, are you getting the right information? If you get the right information, of course, sensible people will act in a rational way and clamp down on things that are wrong and encourage things that are right. If you don't get the information, you're in trouble. You've got to find other ways to try and get signs of information, and that's really where we're up to now, I think. The sort of formulaic approach hasn't worked. It certainly hasn't worked.
And Ian Laughlin's paper on the social condition report is very relevant.
Yes, that's right. I think directors have to use all sorts of different techniques, as well as reading the papers, to try and get a feel for what's really going on in those organisations.
I mean, I'd completely agree. I mean, it's boards get hundreds, as you say, hundreds of pages, and I think that what we'll see is both boards having to synthesise disparate information better to put that together to show signs. And I think also investing a lot more in terms of understanding the relationships. So, you know, the relationships with customers, the relationships with management and staff, the relationships with regulators, and where the, you know, where there's a, where their view, the board's view of that relationship is a lot different to the view that comes back, sort of like find the gaps in those, in the strengths of those relationships, and that's where the weak points in the culture will be, because in the end, a risk management framework will only work if the culture is right in the organisation.
I think the CBA report that John referenced did a great job in terms of getting boards and executives to focus on not the number of complaints and resolution rates, but the actual substance, what's going on, right. Why are you getting these complaints, what's really happening in the organisation.
Yeah,
they can be incredibly illuminating, and I know a number of organisations have made terrific steps forward to get a much better understanding for what's happening.
Okay, some have said that CPS 320 actuaries actuaries more ability to speak up. To what extent should actuaries have always been doing this? Good question. Anyone want to take that?
well, I think some of the remarks that John Lonsdale made about the appointed actuary position are really important here, because he pointed out that over the years, the chief actuary or the appointed actuary has been downgraded in the organisation. And if you think back over the last 20 or so years, if you go back into the 90s, every life company had a very strong cadre of senior executives who had long experience in life insurance. And usually there was at least one actuary amongst the senior group who was not the actuary for the company. And that all changed. We saw numerous, in general insurance too, we saw many people from outside the industry come in as CEOs, thought they were doing a great thing. In general insurance, there were boom times in the early 2000s where after HIH, in fact, when prices went up and profitability went up, and people got very optimistic about what could happen, and a lot of the important things that should have been done were just not being done. And the appointed actuary was seen to be less important, because why do we need all this? We're making terrific profits. We don't need to listen to all the things that they say. Well, of course, the GFC has changed that dramatically, and I was really pleased to see the way the appointed actuary thing has played out, the thing that John was referring to, the new standards that are about to come in. And I notice there's another question here about whether actuaries can actually adapt to this. Well, Steve Somagy's in the room somewhere. I was on the board of the ICA back in the early 2000s when my first meeting, I went in and Steve from APRA had put on the table an FCR. We didn't have FCRs before that for general insurance. And at my first meeting, I heard a couple of CEOs saying, these bloody FCRs, we do not want these things at all. This is interfering in our business in the wrong way. Well, to Steve's credit, he persevered, forced the FCR. Within 2 years, directors of general insurance companies were saying, what a wonderful innovation this is. So there you go. It works, but of course you also need the right actuaries doing the right kind of work and giving the right input to the boards to make that apply. So all that can work. And there's another question about actuaries having the skills. Estelle, I remember you expressing great fears back in the FCR beginning, where actuaries had to comment on risk management issues, and you and some others were fearful that this would go beyond experience. Well, and I was of the opposite view, saying you should take this as an opportunity. Anyway, it's played out well. The actuaries have adapted, and we'll see it again. We'll see that again. So
well,
I'm very pleased about
this next question to Estelle then. Do actuaries need to have additional training to identify non-financial risks?
I would say no. I think, I guess it's just, for me, I think an issue of thinking, of the actuaries actually thinking about non-financial risks and the breadth of risks. So, and I've sort of had this example recently. So in the actuarial advice framework, as in the FCR as well, actuaries need to consider materiality. And I know in some actuarial advice frameworks that I put together, the initial drafting around materiality was all in terms of financial risk. And so my suggestion in those frameworks, and also my encouragement to actuaries in the audience, is to make sure when you're looking at materiality, go back to the risk appetite statement and look at the non-financial risk appetite and look at the materiality in terms of reputational risk and compliance risk. So ensure that when you're thinking about materiality, you're thinking about all of those things. And I think if we do that within the actuarial advice framework and then obviously within the financial condition report, I think that brings us neatly to the right position that we need to take, that we're not just thinking about financial risk.
Yeah.
I mean, again, another example I could give to you on that would be in terms of low-value products. So in the financial condition report, the actuary has to comment on the adequacy of premiums. So you're already doing the work. So, but we don't tend to comment on, are they too adequate? Where are the payout ratios low? Where might the red flags be? Where do companies need to look and convince themselves, yes, this product is valuable to the consumers for these reasons? So I don't think we need additional training. I think we just need to turn our minds and think, as John said, we have to think broadly around what a financial risk is.
Yeah, well, I liked his quote about that these non-financial risks, if left to themselves, become distinctly financial.
Precisely.
So that was good. Okay, how are boards going to respond to shareholders through their proxies' demands to maximise profits at the expense of customers? That's a tough one. Anyone?
Well, I mean, yes. Look, I think it's not a tough one really. Boards are not going to have sustainable profits for shareholders unless they're looking after customers and delivering real value. It really is as simple as that. And it's sad that the industry's gone too far the other way, but it's important now that it comes back. And I think it will, because I think the fundamental needs are there, and there's a lot of clever people working out how we can look after customers better, and that should give profits in due course. I think one of the big issues that we haven't talked about yet in this session is, but it was highlighted by some of our speakers, remuneration systems. I think that members of boards have a responsibility to worry about the remuneration systems throughout the whole organisation, not just those of the top people that normally come to the remuneration committee. And that point's been made, and I think that's absolutely true. But if you're remunerating frontline staff on sales, you'll get sales. If you're remunerating frontline staff on customer satisfaction, you should get better customer satisfaction. It really is as simple as that. I know a lot of that's happening around the industry now, but that's got to be a step in the right direction.
Yeah. How do insurers go about meeting community expectations when those expectations are so diverse? I guess that has a particularly a general insurance kind of flavour to it. Estelle, have you got a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, in the end, I think it's about treating customers fairly and in a way that a reasonable person would consider to be fair. And, I think that's sort of where I would go with community expectations. Obviously, you're never going to meet everybody's expectations. Sometimes a claim won't be paid for good reason and coverage will be denied. So you're never going to meet everyone's expectation. But I think if you sort of bear in mind that it's about treating customers fairly, and that view of what would a reasonable person consider to be fair, then that should sort of guide
and it comes back to the reporting to the board and what information comes, because I think it's become clear, really throughout the last year that particular segments of the population, particularly disadvantaged segments of the population, if they are being treated particularly unfairly, then that's actually, a much greater wrong in a lot of ways. So, that means the reporting to the board has to be in a more segmented way, really.
Absolutely. And I think, again, it's at the point sort of made that obviously the Royal Commission highlighted specific cases, and there's obviously many thousands of cases of customers being very satisfied. But to me, it also says for boards, you can't think of the noisy 1% as just being noise. You've got to sort of understand why they're noisy and whether that's of a concern for you, not just sort of say, oh, well, 99% of people are satisfied, so that's a good result.
Well, product design is a big question here too, especially in life insurance, where there's a history for decades of companies deliberately trying to make products difficult to understand, and it was done to try and gain competitive advantage usually, and to satisfy advisors. And of course, in life insurance, satisfying advisors has been what's led to profitability in life insurance, whereas the world is changing. It's actually the customers themselves that now need to be satisfied. So there's really a lot of work to be done in life insurance here. And what we're seeing, though, in Australia, we're seeing a consolidation of the industry, which at one level you might say is less competition, but on the other hand, the competition might be a lot more rational and a lot more suitable, giving more suitable product design to the community, and I'm hoping that that's one of the directions that it will go in.
Okay, I think we've got time for 2 quick extra ones. And I'm going to ask John, you to do this one. Doesn't the fee-for-no-service fiasco highlight the fact that trail commissions must go? Because obviously John led a whole review into commissions, which you kind of referenced, particularly in life insurance. So, yeah, what's your reflection on that?
Well, I think trail commissions in investment products are a different thing from trail commissions in life insurance.
Yep.
The idea of a trail commission in life insurance, it's really better, it's better described as a renewal commission. And with life insurance being a sort of discretionary product, there's a need for the intermediary, in many cases, to keep in contact with the customer. And the trail commission is meant to be an incentive to do that. If you don't have that, then people just drift off and their needs are not met. So it's a very different concept from general insurance, where it's just it's really a renewal. It's a new business commission every year, and in investment products, it's they don't need renewal the way that life insurance does. So fee for no service is just poor management, because it should be fee for service. And if you're a life company that's got advisors who are not giving service to their customers, then you should try and find that out and do something about it. So I think there's a very real place for renewal commissions.
Yeah, great. And this final question, Trevor, I might direct to you with your board experience, but is there a risk in the new environment directors are drawn across the line into management?
Yeah, that's a very real risk that I think we all have to be vigilant to avoid. It's quite interesting to try and get that balance right between challenging management, but also being somewhat supportive of management, being sceptical of management. But it's very important that directors don't go down into the very detailed complexities of the business. Getting accountability sorted out in these large, complex matrix organisations is a big issue, and I think the BEAR movements in that direction are very, very good. But it's quite clear directors should be up there in a governing role, not in a management role.
Yeah, great. Okay, please join me in thanking our past presidents.